'Tis the season of election season. Anti-war protests have rocked universities and divided an already hyper-partisan climate. The incumbent president, an old tired white man who looks like an owl, has announced he will not be running for re-election after a first term marred by dwindling support from the right and left, even though he established a lot of landmark domestic programs. The vice president, an ex-senator known for cleaning up crime, has taken his place, running a fast-paced campaign against a hard-nosed authoritarian in the making who has already been in the White House. National tensions are so high that one of the candidates was even shot during a campaign stop, and the Democrats are holding their national convention in Chicago. I'm talking, of course, about 1968. Mark Twain once said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." Well, get out your poetry books and bongos, because history is rhyming pretty hard right now. It's easy to think that with the 24-hour news cycle declaring impending doom that we live at the end of history. But what if I told you that these unprecedented times are actually very precedented? In 1968, protests against the war in Vietnam struck universities across the nation. Nearing the end of his first term, incumbent President Lyndon Baines Johnson was running a struggling campaign, thanks in large part to these dumb kids and their anti-war sentiments. And this was in spite of his widespread resume of social reform, such as the war on poverty, the Civil Rights Bill, and education, healthcare, and welfare reforms as part of the Great Society. When Johnson underperformed at the first primary in New Hampshire, he realized he had a choice to make: continue his campaign and ultimately lose the election, or hand over the reins to someone else. Personal health concerns were also a major factor. Privately, LBJ wasn't sure he would survive another presidential term, and he actually ended up dying just 5 years later in 1973. On the other side of the aisle, Richard Nixon was already the clear candidate for the Republicans. Nixon ran on a platform of restoring law and order, and promised to remake the Supreme Court in the Republican image. Kind of like this guy. There had been a couple of early challengers, but none of them really stood a chance. It was Nixon all the way. The Democrats needed a strong candidate, and they needed one now. So LBJ withdrew from the race. Publicly, he remained neutral on who would be the next candidate, but privately he supported his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who had been the mayor of Minnesota some 20 years prior and was known for thinking that bigotry's bad, but LBJ, it's pretty good. Immediately, the Democratic race was super competitive, with a three-way split between Humphrey, Eugene McCarthy, and Robert F. Kennedy. Humphrey, McCarthy, and RFK split primary after primary. Then, on June 5th, 1968, RFK was shot and killed while talking to some supporters outside of a small venue. It was a national tragedy in a year already rife with them. Historians tend to disagree whether RFK would have won the nomination had he survived. He was not the leading candidate at the time, but his anti-war stance made him very popular with the youths. After RFK's death, his supporters split between McCarthy and newcomer George McGovern, pictured here looking like a groovy sitcom dad. Going into the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, no one had the clear upper hand. At the Chicago DNC, thousands of anti-war protesters clashed with police. The public watched in horror as police brutally beat and tear-gassed young activists on national television. Anti-war voters fully turned against the Democrats. Humphrey became the candidate, but the damage was already done. Nixon won the election, and he became president. This election would have major consequences throughout US history. Before 1968, Democrat and Republican voters were demographically swapped from where they are today. Back in the 1800s, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Today, not so much. After 1968, Southern white Democrats would abandon the party, and it would struggle to find its new identity. For the next 40 years, elections would heavily slide in the Republicans' favor. And Richard Nixon, who ran on a platform of peace and stability for the silent majority, would famously expand the unpopular Vietnam War into neighboring countries. And later he would pay some guys to screw him in a hotel. So what does 1968 tell us about 2024? We've always known who the Republican candidate is going to be: Donald Trump. Like Nixon, there were a couple of early challengers, but come on. And, like 1968, old white owl man Joe Biden, citing his declining health and polling numbers, has passed the torch down to his VP, freeing him to be as catty as he wants with the press about all of his social programs and infrastructural achievements. But the biggest difference this year is Kamala Harris. Within 36 hours of Joe Biden stepping down, and importantly, endorsing her, she had effectively secured the votes necessary for her nomination. Harris has been the target of anti-war, or let's call it what it is, anti-genocide protests. But Harris has made it her goal to appear more even-tempered than her rival. And her decision to listen to the protesters instead of beating them or tear-gassing them is a lesson that Humphrey and the Democrats had to learn the hard way. And I don't think Trump learned it at all. And while we can't know for certain who will win, we can look back at 1968 and make some educated guesses as to what will happen over the next 4 years, no matter who is in the Oval Office. First, international tensions with China and Russia will continue to rise. In 1968, in spite of his anti-war stance and efforts to withdraw the troops, Nixon ended up escalating the Vietnam War. Much of the trajectory of a president's foreign policy is determined before they even take office. Kind of like how your parents passed on that generational trauma that you didn't ask for. Today, the world powers of the US, China, and Russia will continue to fight to keep each other in check, especially in regions like Ukraine and Palestine. But the US is in a tricky position, and we're not known for propping up stable governments. When the US did pull out of Vietnam, South Vietnam fell. When the US pulled out of Afghanistan and Iraq, the Taliban quickly took back power. As it stands, the Ukraine war seems like a stalemate with no end in sight, and the Israeli government believes it is fighting a war of survival against its neighbors. Both countries represent key American footholds in their respective areas, and the next president will increase support, even against the public's wishes. Closer to home, there is a recession coming, but much like your ex-boyfriend, it may not be as big as you've been led to believe. High interest rates and low unemployment in the 60s and 70s led to 2 small recessions in 1969 and 1973. The volatility of the international community, combined with the tight labor market, made consumers less willing to spend. The exact same pattern is happening today. The only thing keeping the stock market afloat are ETFs and government spending. The government is just like you and me. Your credit bill doesn't exist if you don't look at it. But most notably, there will likely be a major shift in voting demographics. The MAGA crowd has always been the smallest and loudest part of the Republican Party, and their vice grip on the GOP has dominated the party's platform. But for Democrats, Harris has whipped voters into an ecstatic frenzy. A month ago, this election was over, but now it's up for grabs, with Harris even leading in some polls. If the Democrats win, this could be a crippling or even fatal blow to MAGA Republicans. Trump will be 82 by the time of the next election, which is hopefully too old even for their standards. And there is no heir apparent to take his place, especially with how weird J.D. Vance turned out to be. Many voters are turning to Harris simply because she's not another old white owl man. But if the Republicans defeat Harris, then the Democrats would have blown their biggest wave of support since 2008. Young voters and voters of color would abandon the party entirely, and Democrats would be labeled cringe. The Democrats and Republicans are running this campaign as if their party's lives depend on it. And they might. We know what a Trump presidency looks like. We already survived one, and it ended with an assault on our Capitol. This time Trump is fighting for his freedom, and now he knows what weapons he can use if he's in power, and he has a better team around him, except for J.D. Vance. And make no mistake, Trump and his team would institute Project 2025 and Agenda 47 on day 1. Trump may not actually be interested in running a government, but the weirdos around him are. 2024 is not the end of history. Like in 1968, international conflicts will rage on, a recession is on the way, and national identity will probably change. But while history may rhyme, it doesn't have to repeat. So yeah, grab your bongos and play a little song with me. We don't have to elect a brash authoritarian owlman who spews false promises. We may exist in the context of all that came before, but we can be unburdened by what has been. We can get through this as a community, a coalition, together. And we can build a new, better next chapter for America.